I'll flick the video on so we can see me as well, and hopefully the image is going to change and the video on so we can see me as well. Oh, okay. So this does work. Okay, so we're going to stop our version there and say welcome. Here's Rog coming in, sidling in. A little few technical issues. We'll just make sure that we've actually got. Rog, can you just push the button at the back there on the TV? Thank you. Yes, we're just making sure that actually everything's working, and this is a really great start to the tour. So what I'll do, I will just maximize myself here and welcome. Now we can probably start proper. So my name's Gareth, kia ora.
And I'm Roger.
And together we're
Roger and Gareth.
And this is Walk Tours NZ. So we've been doing tours for the last 3 or so years here in Wellington, New Zealand, around rainbow-related sites, particularly around the central area. And we generally do one a month. So today it was meant to be a physical tour around Wellington, but because of the COVID-19 alert levels, we are doing it virtually instead. So hopefully it's going to be just as interesting and just as compelling, maybe.
If not more.
If not more. Please feel free to write chat comments in the YouTube chat. We should be able to see them on our bit of software here. Here's hoping. So, Rog, maybe let's start where we actually are here in Wellington. Where are we?
Okay, well, this is the very top of Cuba Street here. If you see on this street view, this is the intersection of Cuba and State Highway 1, but we want to start our tour right at the very top of Cuba Street here. And here we go, stopping at this building here.
And what is that building, Roger?
So this is a dry cleaners. Well, it's not dry cleaners. It's actually a gallery here at the top of Wellington, but it's located in Cuba Street is located in Te Aro, which is the inner city suburb of Wellington. Te Aro means the facing, and was thought to have been named by the local iwi, Ngāti Awa, in reference to facing Mount Taranaki, which was where they'd travelled from. Maori settlements dominated Wellington up until the arrival in 1840 of the UK-based New Zealand Company. Now, the company's objective was the systematic colonisation of New Zealand, and they began dividing up the land for European settlement. Te Aro was one of the early areas to be settled because it's so flat. And the collection of historic buildings in this area dated from the 1860s. Now, we have stopped in our tour outside this building, which was Carmen's Curio shop at the top of Cuba Street. It dates from a little later. It dates from about 1901. For the first 4 decades of its operation, it had a variety of occupants. It was a dry cleaning business, had a variety of occupants after that. But then in the 1970s, it became Carmen's Curio shop, the ground floor of it at least. And here's an image of what it was like in the 1970s when Carmen was in residence there.
And jam-packed full of just curios, ephemera, amazing.
That was really a big thing for Carmen. Now, Carmen was a performer, a sex worker, an entrepreneur, a brothel keeper, but she was also an activist, particularly around anti-discrimination and HIV/AIDS causes. There's a great photo here of Carmen. Photos called Kiwi Carmen from the 1960s. Now, Carmen was born in Tauranui in 1936, and she later lived in both Auckland and Wellington. She first began drag performance while doing compulsory military service. Now, that might sound a bit strange, doing drag performance when you were doing compulsory military service, but it must be remembered that the New Zealand Defence Force had a rich history of female impersonators. The Kiwi Concert Party entertained Allied troops in the Middle East, Italy, and the Pacific during the Second World War. And some of the performers included Ralph Dyer here, known stage name Marlena Heatrash, performing here in New Caledonia in 1943. And a number of other performers that would have still been talked about when Carmen joined the military in the 1950s. So after her military service, she moved to Sydney's King's Cross and became Australia's first Maori drag performer, and from that time self-identified as transsexual. In 1967, she returned to Wellington, where she established her international coffee lounge, Le Balcon, cabaret, an Egyptian tea room, a massage parlour, a hotel, and of course the Curio shop that we've stopped outside. Carmen's life was filled with curios, and there's another great image of Carmen in later life in her home in Sydney. And as you can see, she loved to be surrounded by lots of knickknacks and things.
Yes, there's actually a lot of Egyptian kind of memorabilia in there, and on part of the tour coming up very shortly, we'll show you where her Egyptian tea rooms were as well. Well, one of Carmen's many achievements was a landmark court case in the 1960s, and it was about the right to wear female clothing in public. So prior to this point, newspapers in New Zealand are peppered with stories about people being prosecuted for wearing female clothing in public. On the 9th of January 1966, Carmen was arrested in Auckland with, quote, behaving in an offensive manner. And the offensive manner was that she was wearing female clothing, a black frock, black silk stockings, and high-heeled shoes. So she was taken to court, and rather than kind of accepting the charge, she defended it. And she went to court in female attire. And the police told her to go home and dress in male clothing. But she said, no, you caught me as a woman, you charged me as a woman, and I'm going to court as a woman. Well, Justice McCarthy not only found that there was completely no case and dismissed it, but also said in the decision notes that, quote, he was quite unable to find anything in our law which says that it is unlawful for a male to attire himself in female clothing. And that was a real watershed moment here in New Zealand. In many ways, Carmen was well ahead of her time in terms of kind of the legal framework in New Zealand. She fought or advocated for homosexual law reform in the 1970s and also prostitution law reform as well. Law reform for homosexuals, for homosexual activity didn't happen until 1985, 1986. And prostitution reform didn't happen in New Zealand until 2003. So she was actually a real trailblazer and really stood up on a whole variety of issues.
Well, moving on now to our next stop, which is actually just a few steps down from where we are here, and we'll just take you down there.
And we're looking at the building, the small building with the red bricks in the foreground there.
So this was the first location of the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, and they operated here from October 1988. The collective was formed in 1987 by a diverse group of sex industry workers with the aim of providing support and education. Shortly after forming, they were contracted by the Ministry of Health to provide a range of services focusing on HIV/AIDS prevention. Now, the collective shared this space with the National People Living with AIDS Union, and that was based here from 1988 until the early 1990s. And it was also the home of Wellington's first needle exchange program. Well, right from the start, the collective was a driving force for prostitution law reform, and that call was taken up by the Labour MP Tim Burnett, who introduced the Prostitution Law Reform Bill in Parliament in 2000. Now, the purpose of law reform was to enable sex workers to have access to the same protections afforded other workers in other industries. In June 2003, New Zealand became the first country in the world to decriminalise sex work. Prior to this, sex work hadn't been explicitly illegal, but there were a range of offences that could be committed in association with acts of prostitution, and these were policed and prosecuted. For example, from 1908 onwards, any person who kept a common bawdy house for the purposes of prostitution, along with its tenants, was liable for 2 years imprisonment with hard labour.
But surprise, surprise, even though it may have been illegal, it didn't stop it from happening. And sometimes it was a lot more blatant than on the quiet. And one of those kind of blatant expressions, I guess, was at Carmen's International Coffee Lounge in Vivian Street. And so Carmen's International Coffee Lounge was a 2-story location, and on the ground floor you had your coffee lounge, and then above it you had rooms for sex work. And to let Carmen know that the type of liaison that you wanted, it was using a coded cups. So you'd have your cup of coffee, and then if you put a saucer on top of a cup, that was for a heterosexual liaison. I might have that wrong, actually. Let me take that back. I think the saucer on top of the cup was for a homosexual liaison, on its side was for a heterosexual liaison, and a cup upside down was for a heterosexual.
I'm not sure.
Oh, I'm going to read the script. Just one.
This is what happens.
Let's take this back. Okay, so a cup upside down is for a heterosexual liaison. On its side was for a transgender liaison, and a cup placed beneath the saucer was for a homosexual liaison.
Okay.
That's the right order. Okay, so now apparently Carmen had a wonderful line for patrons that were giving her a bit of jib. She would say to them, "Do you want a fuck or a fight? Because I can give you both." That's a great line. Oh, now, just before we leave, let's get this back. Just before we leave this location, we can just see the peak of a A-framed roof in the back there. Just there. That's part of the same house, but this is what we see when we go from the other side. So we're looking towards Cuba Street now, and we're actually looking at one of the oldest surviving buildings in Te Aro. This is built in the 1860s. It's a lovely,
very cute,
cute cottage, and that actually sits behind the shop frontage. It's all one. I think it's all one building, but there's this building on the front itself.
Well, moving on to our next stop, and we'll just pause outside another bit of early architecture from the period.
And what we're looking at is on the left-hand side here with the awning. That is the place we're going to be looking at. If we can just scoot around a wee bit.
There we go. So this is an example of architecture and commercial architecture from about 1900. Its original location, in fact, was across the road from where it is now, and it was sort of disassembled and then reassembled on this side of the road when they put the bypass through State Highway 1.
And we should just point out that Carmen's Egyptian tea room is actually on the left-hand side of this building. So
just where we are sitting.
Yeah, just over a little bit from us on the left, and so that's where Carmen's would have been.
So the architect for this commercial building was Thomas Turnbull, and along with his son William, they were two of Wellington's most significant architects of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Thomas was born in Scotland in 1824. He immigrated to Melbourne in the 1850s and then moved to San Francisco. Failing health saw him move to New Zealand, where he continued to practice as an architect. He died in 1907, but his son William carried on the firm. And it was William Turnbull who built this amazing looking house on Bowen Street here in Wellington. This is just opposite the Beehive. Not on our tour today, but it's a lovely example of a house designed by William Turnbull. And you might be thinking, because it was actually built for Alexander Turnbull. And you might be thinking, was there a connection? Well, in fact, no, they weren't related at all. William Turnbull and Alexander Turnbull were not related.
You may also be going, because of Alexander Turnbull himself, because we'll show you a photo of Alexander, quite a dashing man in his day. So Alexander was born in 1868 here in Wellington, and he moved with some of his family to the United Kingdom, but then he returned in his early 20s and spent the rest of his life here in Wellington. So he was a merchant and also an avid collector. So he would collect manuscripts, photographs, maps, books, a whole range of things. He amassed in his lifetime, it's over 55,000 items, which is huge. He had Turnbull House, that lovely brick building we saw just recently. He had that built in 1915 to house his collections. And then, unfortunately, in 1918, he had an operation on his sinuses, and he actually died as the result of that operation, which is very sad. Before he did die, or before he died, he actually bequeathed his entire collection to the nation. And so this is where we get the formation of New Zealand's first National Library collection of his 55,000 plus items. So the Alexander Turnbull Library now is held within the National Library of New Zealand. So what an amazing gift. What a really amazing gift.
Very fortunate.
And an amazing person. Now, in early gay circles, apparently Alexander was known as, quote, a screaming queen, but there is no other kind of documentary evidence that would kind of support that. But I'm not quite sure what kind of evidence you'd need.
Well, he never married.
He never married.
So,
Yeah.
what does that tell you? So let's go on to our next stop now, which is a little bit further down the road. This is the People's Palace.
Yep, and I'll just put Roger's map up. And so we're just heading kind of northwards down Cuba Street. And the People's Palace is going to be coming up on our right-hand side. Now, the People's Palace was built by the Salvation Army. And it's just coming up very shortly. And here we have it on the right. It's quite a large building. It was built over a number of years, so 1904. And the 1904 part is the leftmost part of that building. I think it was only 2 stories. And then it was subsequently added to in 1916 and then in 2003. And the People's Palace, they were built both in Australia and New Zealand to, quote, assist the fallen and suffering brothers and sisters and to rescue outcasts. So they provided cheap accommodation that was kind of liquor-free, and it was for travellers and for families as well. Now, before the People's Palace was on the site here in New Zealand, in Wellington. In fact, I think this is the only surviving People's Palace in the Southern Hemisphere. I could be wrong on that, but I think it may be. But before the People's Palace was here, we had another Salvation Army site, and that was called the Paulina Rescue Home. And that opened in 1894. And if we'd been staying there around that time, we would have come across a very young Eugene Fellini, and I've got a photo here of Eugene. So Eugene, this is a police mugshot from Australia.
Now, Eugene was born in Italy in 1875 and came to New Zealand at the age of 2 with his family. Now, he was the eldest of 22 children, 17 of whom survived into adulthood. Eugene was working at Murphy's Brickworks in Taranaki Street when he was taken to court for impersonating a man. Now, around 1895, he ran away to sea, aged 21. Eugene was raped multiple times by the ship's captain and had a baby in Sydney in 1898. Staying in Sydney and changing his name to Harry Crawford, he married twice, and he was charged and subsequently convicted of murdering one of those wives in 1920. Now, the evidence for the murder conviction was circumstantial, and from today's standards, it looks far from compelling. Nevertheless, he was convicted. He died, sadly, in 1938 after being released from prison and stepping off the pavement and into the path of an oncoming car.
Well, just a little bit further down from the People's Palace, we'll just show you on the map here. We're going to this corner building, which is called the Morgans Building, built in the 1920s, and currently it has an ombre sign on it. It didn't always have the ombre sign, to be honest. Let's have a look back in the 1970s, and this is what it looked like. So you had a large striptease sign on the first and second floors of the building. Really well known in Wellington for that sign. And then underneath it, we had Janus hairstylists. Now, Janus hairstylists. Now, you may know of George Janus, who is a hairstylist in Wellington, has a number of stores around Wellington. This is where George started out. His father, Anthony, purchased this in the 1930s, and George began working here in 1953. And for a long time, there was always a hairstylist on that ground floor. And then on the first floor in the 70s, we had Club Exotic, and that was a club owned by Emmanuel Papadopoulos. And it was originally called Club Exotic, but then turned into Club Exotique to just give it a bit of a twist.
A little extra something. Well, the famous New Zealand actor and drummer Bruno Lawrence worked there for a time, accompanying strippers with drum rolls and fanfares. Carmen worked here from the 1960s, along with Georgina Buyer, who worked here from the mid-1970s. And in a great interview that Georgina did a few years ago, she remembered working there. She said, "The only queens that got to work in clubs and do the full-on stripping had to be extraordinarily good-looking and unspringable. The exploitation was horrendous in lots of ways, but better to be inside a strip club on a cold and wet, windy Wellington night than stuck out on a corner trying to pick up a client." She went on, "I'd finish doing a spot up at the Club Exotic, race downstairs in my bra and panties and perhaps with a fabulous cape on, and sort of fly across Vivian Street to get to the Purple Onion to fill in and do a spot there." Now, the Purple Onion was Wellington's first drag club, and it was located just next to where the Subway shop is now on Vivian Street, and we can go there.
We can actually, yes.
Virtually.
Let's turn around the corner. So we're just going into Vivian Street, squeaking around the corner. And here we are. So the literally we're just a stone's throw away. It's where the Subway building is now. That's where the Purple Onion used to be. And we'll just go back to where we were. So when you could easily walk between these different venues.
This is the Club Exotic.
Club Exotic there, yeah. Well, Georgina Buyer has had an amazing life and continues to have an amazing life. Georgina was born in Wellington in 1957, and she lived in various parts of Wellington before moving with some of her family to Auckland. She attended Papatoetoe High School and developed a real love for drama and acting. She won the College Cup for Drama in 1972 and then left school at the age of 16. And she came back down to Wellington and worked in the kind of adult entertainment areas in the kind of Cuba Street, Vivian Street area. In the 1980s, she had some really big dramatic roles. She was nominated in the National Film and Television Awards for Best Actress in a Dramatic Role. And then in the 1990s, she moved into politics. And this is an image here of Georgina as Mayor of Carterton District. The Carterton District is just north of Wellington. And this was fantastic. This was a world first because it's the first time an openly transgender person had become mayor anywhere in the world, which was really stunning. And then in 1999, Georgina again made world headlines by becoming the first openly transgender member of parliament in the world. Again, a remarkable, fantastic achievement for Georgina. And also the Carterton district, who voted her in. It was really, really fantastic. So among other things in Parliament, Georgina fought for prostitution reform. She fought for gender identity legislation and also for civil unions. And I think was in Parliament until about, was it late 2000s, 2007-ish, 2008, I think, yeah.
Right, well, just before we leave, we should have a look at one of Carmen's streetlights. These are streetlights, that's right, that's the walk signal as you cross the road. And this whole Upper Cuba precinct has these as the walk signal on the lights, which is a great sort of memorial to Carmen. We should go now to our next stop, which is just a block away from here, but there's a bit of a content warning about it.
Yes, so this next story involves a local hate crime and is graphic. So if you don't want to hear this, it takes us around about 3 or 4 minutes to cover. And you'll know that it's finished when we start showing the Google map again in terms of moving to our next location.
Okay, so early in the morning of the 8th of May 1999, 14-year-old Jeff Whittington is sitting here on the curb of this petrol station. He's had a night out, he's drunk and he's high. At 4:20 a.m, a police officer talks to Jeff. He says he's okay, and so the officer leaves. Also out drinking that night are 2 men in their mid-20s, Stephen Smith and Jason Meads. By chance, they drive by Jeff here at the petrol station. He's a complete stranger to them. The 2 men stop the car and start talking to Jeff. Well, all 3 eventually wind up a short drive away in Ara Valley to smoke a joint, and it's here that Stephen and Jason beat Jeff to death. Now, the pair later boasted to acquaintances that they'd beaten up a faggot who'd been wearing makeup. And they told their acquaintances that they'd never seen anyone bleed from the places that he bled from. Well, Stephen and Jason admitted to punching and kicking him, but they denied stomping on his head and say that they never meant to kill him. Jeff suffers severe brain damage. He has boot marks on his skin and has a ruptured bowel. A woman finds him alone lying in a puddle at 4:40 a.m. He dies the next day in hospital. Well, the jury convicts both Stephen and Jason of murder and they're sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, Jason was released from prison in 2013 and Stephen was freed on parole in April 2017. Now, he's been released on 3 previous occasions and on each occasion recalled to prison.
Well, Jeff's killing happened very soon after, just months after Matthew Shepard being killed in a hate crime in Wyoming in the USA, and both hate crimes had a really significant impact on people in the rainbow communities, both here and overseas. One person it impacted was playwright Ronald Trefero Nelson, and Ronald has subsequently written a play about Jeff called Corner 4am and Cuba. And it was premiered at Bats Theatre here in Wellington in 2007. And Bats is a very small, not small, intimate venue. I think it's around 100 seats. And a few years ago, Ronald was telling us how on opening night, both the victim's family and also the perpetrator's family were in the audience, and just how charged that evening was. But it's good now to be able to remember Jeff, and I can't believe it. He would be in his mid-30s by now. Well, we're going to move on now to St. Peter's in Willis Street, and we're just going from Willis Street, and Roger's going to actually click on the map because it's actually around about a 7-minute walk.
Yeah, it's a couple of blocks away from the petrol stations.
You don't get the exercise when you're doing it virtually, do you? And we're actually going to St. Peter's Church on Willis Street. And this is what St. Peter's originally looked like. I think the original building is on the left. The little bit on the right with the doorway is added in 1866. But St. Peter's Anglican Church was built in 1847, and this is just 7 years after European settlement colonisation occurred in 1840. So it was very quickly established. I think actually the first church here in Wellington was St. Andrew's, and that Presbyterian congregation met almost immediately. They landed in 1840, but the Anglicans weren't far behind. This is 1847. And almost right from the get-go, the church was used for a whole variety of purposes, including we had a large earthquake here in 1848, the Marlborough earthquake, and the church was used as emergency accommodation. After that, the church kind of grew and grew and grew, and by the 1870s, it was described as, quote, a large, straggling, disproportionate, shapeless, hideous deformity, and a replacement church was planned. And that replacement church is the one we see here nowadays.
Yeah.
And this is actually, the architect was Thomas Turnbull, who we've mentioned earlier, and he was the architect of this particular church.
Well, the main reason that we are standing here is that in June 1967, the Reverend Godfrey Wilson delivered a sermon highlighting the negative treatment of homosexuals. It was a radical call for acceptance and inclusion at that time. Now, remember that this was almost 20 years before homosexual law reform happens in New Zealand in the mid-1980s, and so many people at the time viewed homosexuality as a perversion and certainly not a matter of human rights. For example, there's a fantastic newspaper article here from 1967 in which Detective Superintendent F.A. Gordon, or if you like acronyms, FAG, asks people in Christchurch, do we want our cities overrun with pimps, ponces, pansies, pussyfoots, and perverts? You might be saying yes to all that, but in 1967 the answer was a resounding no. So the Reverend Godfrey's sympathetic sermon was broadcast live on national radio, and it was probably the first sermon of its kind in New Zealand. The core of the sermon was about a man named John, who is met in prison by a chaplain. John is working in a bank, but he's now in prison due to his homosexuality. John says to the chaplain, if you fall in love and marry, well, that's fine, but if I fall in love and want to share it, that's perversion and must be persecuted and punished. In 2017, the service was repeated to mark the 50th anniversary of that landmark 1967 church service. This time it was led by the Reverend Annette Cater, who at the end blessed the rainbow banners in the church, which included one that she'd made from materials given to her by her mother, who makes clergy vestments. Now, her blessing was, we know that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and all that is in it. God said it is good, all of it. And so in that spirit, may these banners be a symbol of that all-encompassing, generous, amazing, unending love for all, that all who see it may be overwhelmed by the power of that love and know, God, that you are a God of love.
We're going to move now just a bit further down Willa Street, and we're heading to what was once called Baptist House. And Baptist House used to have a Bible store on the ground level, and apparently it would often be filled with Russian sailors as they were going to pick up their Bibles. And we're just going back a little bit, just a wee bit too far there. And Baptist House is now on the right-hand side here. Well, on the right-hand side, I mean, it's almost in the centre, okay. And it is the kind of brick building here. So nowadays it holds a number of different organisations, including on the second floor, the Lilac Lesbian Lending Library. That's been there for a number of years. The library is run by a group of women, a collective, and it is the, if not the, one of the largest lesbian lending libraries in the Southern Hemisphere. And so that's on the second floor. And then on the first floor, we have the New Zealand AIDS Foundation's Athena Centre. And the Athena Centre has been around for, well, since the late 1980s. It's in fact the second HIV/AIDS clinic in New Zealand, the first one being the Burnett Centre in Auckland, and that was established in the mid-80s. And I'll see if I can get an image here of Bruce Burnett, who the centre is named after. And so Bruce Burnett was an Aucklander. He was born in New Zealand, but had lived overseas in the 1970s and early 1980s. And in 1983, he came back to New Zealand feeling unwell, and he had come back from San Francisco. In 1984, he began a one-man road trip around New Zealand trying to educate at-risk communities around HIV and AIDS. In Palmerston North, he really courageously came out as somebody with AIDS. And I say courageously because at the time there was a lot of stigma and discrimination around people with HIV or AIDS. And, people would say things like, oh, you can't share the same utensils, you can't go to the same swimming pool, you can't use the same bathroom, all of which are completely wrong. But this is what, Bruce and others had to put up with. Bruce became one of the front people for HIV safer sex prevention campaigns in New Zealand. He did a lot of television, a lot of media, and was really out there trying to educate people about, what was coming, what had happened in San Francisco, and what potentially was going to happen here in New Zealand. At the same time, he was helping to co-found the AIDS Support Network, and the AIDS Support Network was being set up throughout New Zealand by a whole range of people who wanted to offer kind of practical, emotional, financial support to people living with AIDS or HIV. Bruce worked right up until his death. He died on the 1st of June 1985, and he was aged 30. And shortly after that, the AIDS Support Network got more funding from the government and turned into the New Zealand AIDS Foundation. And this is where we see the birth of the New Zealand AIDS Foundation. And it was really spearheaded by people like Bruce. So again, really lovely to be able to remember him today.
So carrying on down Willis Street to our next stop.
It's always a lovely day in Google land. Wellington's always like this: blue skies, light cloud, no wind.
There we go. The Willis Street Village is our next stop. Yep, no, you can't beat Wellington on a good day, and here's the proof. So this is Willis Street Village. It was designed by architect Roger Walker and built in 1979. It was the fourth and final location for the Dorian Society, which occupied a space at the back top left centre. You can't really see in this photo, through the arch anyway, and down to the back of the courtyard there. Occupied a space there shortly after the centre opened until 1988. The Dorian Society was established in 1962, and it was the first New Zealand organisation for homosexual men, although homosexuality wasn't mentioned in club rules or minutes. Its objective was to promote among its members an honest desire to serve the development of friendship, mutual respect, and tolerance in all its aspects. Now, it was primarily a private social club that avoided political action, but in 1963, it took the first steps towards homosexual law reform in New Zealand by forming a legal subcommittee that collected books and other resources. Now, this led to the formation of the New Zealand Homosexual Law Reform Society later in the 1960s. So the Dorian had a number of different locations around Wellington, including on Lambton Quay near Cable Car Lane, and it had an all-male policy for some time. Lesbians weren't accepted as members or even as visitors at the beginning, but certainly by the time it was here at the Willis Street Village, they were. Now, the village was also the site of Outrage, which was a lesbian-owned private club in Wellington, operating from 1991 until 1993.
Well, just a little bit further down Willis Street, we're going to stop at two sites. The first one being the Pollen House, was the house of Dr. Henry Pollen. Roger will talk to us about that very shortly. And we can see it's just right on the corner.
Just can't quite get round.
We just can't quite turn the corner. Nearly there. Yep, getting there slowly. No, we're going backwards. Lovely wooden house built in 1902. In fact, that wasn't really the original location of the house. It was actually a bit further up Bullcock Street, which we're actually going to now. So we'll try and get up the corner. And I think we've gone
somewhere in
the terrace.
Yeah.
Gosh. I mean, Wellington's small, but it's not that small.
Small.
It's not that small. No. But what I might do is, while Rog finds the map, I will show you. On the left here, we have the Pollen House, and that is where it was originally located, and that's opposite St Mary's on Bullcock Street. And to the next door of it, on the right-hand side, is Bullcock Chambers. And Bullcock Chambers was a really important building or site in Wellington's Rainbow history. In the 70s and 1980s, it was the site of the Women's Resource Centre, the Haye Women's Health Collective, and the Gay Community Centre. So that it also housed the gay switchboard for people to call up to. On the third floor was the Lesbian Centre, the first of its kind, which opened in 1980. And on the third floor was the Lesbian and Gay Rights Resource Centre. And the purpose of that centre was to really be a focal point for information around homosexual law reform, around HIV and AIDS, any other legal issues, censorship, health, a whole range of things. And it was actually, I'll just go back to this map here. So on the left we have St Mary's, and on the right is where the Bullcock Chambers would be. But the Lesbian and Gay Rights Resource Centre, which was in that building, was actually targeted twice by arson. And here is what it looked like after the second arson attempt. And this is Phil Parkinson looking through the damage. So the first was in October 1985, and the second actually occurred after homosexual law reform had passed. And so that was on the 11th of September 1986. And yeah, really sad that it was firebombed twice. They never found the people that did it. I think there were witnesses saying that there were two Christian-looking young men scuttling away. The arsonists had twinked fag into the floor, so we kind of know what their kind of mindset was. But yes, it's a shame that occurred.
Well, the Pollen House was right next door to this activist hub, and a couple of years after law reform, it was moved down to its corner site, which is where it is now, and rotated 90 degrees. Here's an image from 1988 before it was moved to its present site. It's quite an amazing image, that one there. So this was the house of Dr. Pollen. It was his home and surgery. He actually died here in 1918 after contracting influenza during the pandemic that swept through New Zealand and the world that year. He was the Wellington Port Health Officer and contracted the virus while inspecting overseas ships in the harbour. His wife Catherine had died in 1894, and he lived here in this house with two daughters, Effie and Dorothy. Effie was born in 1879 and is mainly remembered these days for her long-term relationship with the famous New Zealand poet Ursula Bethel, which lasted over 30 years. Here's a great photo of Ursula and Cat. Now, the two met in London in 1905, and they lived overseas for many years, not returning to live in New Zealand until they were in their 40s. When Pollen returns to New Zealand, Bethel follows. And there's a suggestion that for some time they may have lived together in this house, but they certainly, by 1919, were living together in Christchurch at Rise Cottage. And this is an image of the interior of Rise Cottage. So Effie kept house while Bethel wrote her poetry. And in fact, Bethel wrote most of her poetry during this period, describing their home and life together. Bethel called Pollen her little raven. Even though they lived together, they were at pains to travel on travel separately on public transport so as not to arouse suspicion. So while they guarded their privacy, they did invite friends to visit, including members of the Rainbow community like artist Toss Wollaston, poet Charles Brash, and Walter Darcy Cresswell. Well, a few days after Bethel's 60th birthday, Pollen complained of severe headaches and went to bed and died 3 weeks later of a brain hemorrhage. Now, the distraught Bethel wrote openly of her grief for Pollen in letters and in the 6 memorial poems composed on the anniversary of Pollen's death. The sixth and final poem, Spring 1940, she asks God to match spring with vision, spirit of beauty, bring with your persuasive love to the inward eye awakening, lest looking on this life to count what life has taken, I cannot bear the pain. So Effie is buried in Karori Cemetery and Ursula is buried in North Canterbury.
Just before we leave this location, I'm just going to get Rog to turn around and we'll look at Parrot's Corner. And this is just an just a couple of interesting things. So we've got Parrot's Corner on the left here, and on the right we've got the Hotel St George. I might just have a better look at that. And so the Hotel St George, built in 1929, but it's really welcomed some really famous guests over that time. We had Alfred Hitchcock staying here in 1967. We had aviator Jean Batten. This is before the historic flight from London to Auckland. Stayed here. Actors Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh stayed here in 1948, and the Beatles in 1964. And there's a really fantastic shot, which we don't have, is of the Beatles on one of those upper balconies waving to thousands and thousands of people. So it's a very important hotel here in central Wellington. The other interesting point is, if we just pan to the left a wee bit, that is Parrot's Corner. And Parrot's Corner has been here for a very long time, and I'm going to show you an image we found when we put this tour together. Parrot's Corner is where that yellow dot is now. So I'll just go back to what it currently looks like, and then back to the shot from the 1860s. The reason why this image is so interesting for us is that we are so close to the waterfront. Wellington nowadays, all of that water you see there pretty much is, a lot of it is filled in with land now. But here in 1860, we're only a block away from the actual waterfront. And when I say filled in with land, this is where things like Civic Square and the library are,
police station.
The police station. So there's been a lot of development in Wellington. So for Wellingtonians that have been here a while, it's quite interesting to see how close you are to the waterfront just on Parrot's Corner. So we're going to head now to our very last stop. And our very last stop is actually on the corner of Manners and Victoria Street. And what we're looking at is a building that used to be there called the Pillbox. And the Pillbox was really interesting because it, just lost myself. It was really interesting because it had a very interesting octagonal shape to it. And the Pillbox was a chemist, and it was one of Henry Britton's chemists. And we've actually got an old photo of it here. So you can kind of see the octagonal style of the building.
Yeah, see at least 3 of the 8.
I'm sure there'll be other there'll be other sides there. It's like, but the what it looks like now is actually this building right in the centre picture, which has kind of got a kind of a similar kind of look.
There's a nod to the multi-sided building that was there. Box, yeah. And if we popped in for a medicinal remedy when it was the Pillbox, we'd probably have spoken to a young Robert Gant, who was Britton's apprentice for 4 years before moving to Masterton in 1882. Now, Robert Gant loves photography and the theatre, and he has a long career as a female impersonator, taking the stage name Cecil Riverton. And the Evening Post declared Cecil as achieving a pronounced success in the part of Little Buttercup in the 1881 production of HMS Pinafore.
And this is Cecil on the right-hand side here.
This is a different production, but still Cecil.
Yes, yeah. So Robert loved the theatre, but also loved photography, and as a chemist was able to develop his own photography. He had access to chemicals and so forth. So in the late 1880s, he moved to Masterton, and he began taking photographs. And so these are some of his images. And we can see that not only are they, brilliantly posed, but also homoerotic. And when you think this is rural New Zealand in the 1880s and 1890s. And here's another one. And so Robert in this image is the person on the left-hand side. without the cap. And here are some more. And these images are actually of Charlie Haye. And Charlie Haye was the son of the Greytown butcher. And not only did Robert photograph Charlie, but they also developed a relationship. And a long-lasting relationship. They moved back to Wellington and they lived in Seatoun for over 25 years. Charlie was, I think he was behind the fabric counter at the DIC department store. And so these are really lovely, touching images of Charlie. So the reason why we have these images is because when Robert died, the images were passed to Charlie, and then those images were passed through Charlie's family, who subsequently deposited them with Alexander Turnbull Library. So it's quite a nice tie-in with Alexander Turnbull. But, you know, you think, gosh, one, that these images were taken, how remarkable is that in the 1880s, 1890s in rural New Zealand? But also, it's remarkable that the images have survived and that we can view them nowadays, because at any point in time, they could have just been put in the rubbish. So it's a remarkable thanks to Charlie and Charlie's family and Robert for taking the images, and for them being preserved at the Alexander Turnbull Library. It's really stunning. Yeah. And on that really nice note, it's a nice note, isn't it? It's a nice note to end. This is actually going to be the end of our walk tour. We really thank you for being part of today's walk tour. We've really enjoyed bringing it to you.
Thank you for sort of coming into our bubble,
yes,
in a virtual way.
In a virtual way, yeah. So that's been lovely. Our next walk tour is going to be at the start of October, and hopefully by that time we will be down an alert level and we'll be able to do this in a physical sense. But if not, we'll be here, and you'll be most welcome to join us. So have a lovely afternoon.
And see you next time.
See you next time.
Ka kite.
Bye.